Aunt Jeanette and Uncle Robert never had any children, which is probably why they were always so excited for me to spend the summer with them in Wexford County, Michigan. They moved to Detroit a long time ago, and then, about a year ago, my aunt died. I don't live anywhere near Michigan, so I couldn't even attend the funeral. I still remember how I used to love spending the summer with her and her husband. Not every summer, of course, but I think I had been there about 7 times when I was a kid. I remember the meadows surrounding my aunt's house and the woods nearby. I would always have a great time when I was at Aunt Jeanette's place. That one summer, however, I had just turned 12 years old. It did not leave me with only happy memories. My aunt and uncle welcomed me into their home, and since I was tired, let me go to bed early. When I woke up in the morning, I made my way into the kitchen where Jeanette and Robert were preparing breakfast. After eating, they told me to follow them outside. I saw the excited looks on their faces as they said they had a surprise for me. Behind the house, there was a large tree growing in the middle of one of the meadows. It was closer to the woods than to the actual house, but it was still on my aunt and uncle's property. The two of them took me by the hands and led me towards the tree. Here we are. Now, it's a little late for your birthday gift, and I'm not sure if you're not a bit too old for something like this, but I think you'll like it. We worked really hard on it, Janet said and pointed up to the treetop. There, partially hidden amongst the branches, sat a small, beautiful treehouse. What do you think, kid? Robert asked. I love it, I squealed. Thank you so much. Can I go inside? Oh, go right ahead, sweetheart, Aunt Jeanette said softly. There's a rope ladder at the side of the tree. I ran towards the tree and I climbed up the ladder. As I finally reached the top, I pulled myself up and I set foot into my treehouse for the first time. It was amazing. It was not very big, but I loved it from the very first moment. There was a gray rug on the floor and it even had 3 windows, so one could look outside to either side of the treehouse. Looking out of the window across from the entrance, one could see the woods. To the left and right, I had a nice view over the grass fields, and as I turned around to look out of the entrance, I could see my aunt and uncle on the ground waving at me. I spent almost the entire day in that treehouse. At first, Aunt Jeanette and Uncle Robert kept me company. We played board games and just fooled around in the tree. Uncle Robert kept pretending to stumble and fall out through the entrance to make us laugh, and my aunt told us jokes. After a few hours, Jeanette had to go back to the house to cook lunch, leaving me alone with Robert, still laughing. I leaned out of the treehouse to gaze after Janet, and then I turned around to face my uncle again. The grin quickly faded from my face when I noticed his expression had changed. Just a moment ago, he had a wide grin on his face, but now he looked stern and somehow even a bit worried. Robert, I asked carefully, is something the matter? He just sat there and looked at me for a while without answering. It felt like an eternity, and finally he opened his mouth and said, Look, kid, your aunt doesn't like me talking about this stuff. She says that it freaks her out and that it's just stupid and weird. I don't. He stopped for a second, took off his cap, and he wiped his brow. I do not want to scare you. This is not some kind of made-up campfire story. I just want you to be safe. You're getting older, and older kids want to stay up longer. They don't get tired that soon anymore, and they'll want to stay outside longer. After dark. That's why I'm telling you this. He paused again and he looked at me. I stared back at him with wide eyes, waiting for him to reveal whatever it was that his wife did not want him to talk about. There's some things in the woods. I don't know if it's just one, it could be a whole bunch. Either way, I saw it and so have others. That's why I know I just didn't dream it up or something. Your aunt has never seen one, so I don't blame her for not believing me. but I hope that you do. The thing I saw was messed up. It was not like any animal you ever read about in a book. In fact, I think it wasn't an animal at all. That's why your auntie thinks that I'm crazy. He paused once again. I bet you think that I'm crazy now too. A little, I answered honestly. My uncle laughed. Well, I guess it really does sound a bit weird. If I told you that there's a monster in the woods that only comes out at night, you wouldn't believe it, I assume. What if I told you there were a bunch of dangerous wild animals? Would you believe me then? I mean, I guess. Well then, there's wild animals in the woods, kid. Don't go in there after dark. I won't. I promised, confused and unsure of what to say. My uncle grinned at me. We continued to play some more board games until my aunt called us in to eat. It was as if the conversation my uncle and I had just had never even took place. But still, I could not stop thinking about what he had told me. After lunch, I went back out to the treehouse, but it was not quite as fun all on my own, so I asked my aunt and uncle to go on a walk with me. They said sure, and we went into the woods. After having walked for quite a while, my uncle had the glorious idea to play hide and seek. I was the first one to seek, and it was my uncle that I found first. He wasn't very good at it. He had been hiding under a tree when I found him. He stood up so quickly too that he hit his head on a thick branch. In the end, my aunt had to go back to the house with him since he was bleeding a little bit. I said I wanted to stay in the woods just a little bit longer, and after thinking it over, my aunt said that it was okay, but that I should be home by sunset. I told her that I would. Thoughts of Robert's warning still in the back of my head. I gazed after them as they walked away, and then I began to look for a tree I could climb. Climbing trees was kind of my thing back then. I was actually pretty good at it, and I loved the challenges, so I chose the really large trees. I was tall for my age, so I could easily reach the first few branches. I carefully pulled myself up and then reached for the next branch, and then the next. It was difficult, and I started to get a little exhausted, so I decided to take a short break. I held onto the branch above me, and I dared to look down. I let out a gasp when I noticed how high up I was. And that's when I heard it. A loud crack coming from right above me. Suddenly, there was nothing there to hold on to anymore, and before I knew it, I was falling. I shrieked, and I felt a throbbing pain erupting in my left leg as soon as I hit the ground. I tried to stand up, but I couldn't. Tears began to well up in my eyes, and I knew there was no use in trying to scream for my aunt and uncle. So I had two possibilities. I could either wait until they came back to look for me, or I could try to somehow hobble back to the house. I decided on the second option. I got on all fours and I began to crawl, trying to put as little weight as possible onto my left leg. But no matter how slow I went, the pain in my leg only worsened, so I had to sit down after about 10 minutes. It took me a moment to catch my breath until I felt like I could carry on. I managed to get a little bit further this time. I sat down under a tree, again breathless, and I began examining my aching leg. I didn't think it was broken, but I assumed that I had sprained my ankle. I let out a long sigh and I leaned back against the tree. I wanted to rest, just for a minute or two. I had to. I closed my eyes. The cry of a bird startled me awake. I shot up. In shock, I realized that my surroundings were illuminated by the surreal-looking light of sunset. I shouldn't have allowed myself to fall asleep. The sun was setting and I was supposed to be home by now. I began dragging myself through the underbrush. Soon I began to pant, and the sweat running down my cheeks and forehead did little to cool me off. And yet I had to get home somehow. The edge of the woods was still nowhere in sight though. Maybe my aunts and uncle would come back looking for me, I told myself. But still, I should at least try to get a little closer. This way it would be easier for them to find me. I assumed that Jeanette had patched up Uncle Robert by now. The thought of him reminded me of what he had told me, what he had warned me of. The light of the setting sun was now rapidly fading away. It was getting darker and darker, and I was still not out of the woods. I began to get nervous. I kept on crawling though, trying to gain speed. But no matter how hard you try to hurry up, you're never very fast when you're down on all fours and can't even use both of your legs properly. The sweat on my face began to mix with the tears dripping from my eyes. I never was very brave or tough, and to be honest, I stayed a crybaby for a long time after that. I was just about to sit down and start bawling my eyes out when I heard it. Barking. A dog was barking somewhere, and as far as I could tell, it was not all that far away. I stayed still and focused. For a short while, everything was silent, and then I heard it again. It was closer this time, just a tiny bit, but still noticeable. I began to panic. Something about this was wrong. The barking came from deeper within the woods. If somebody was walking their dog, I couldn't hear them. Only the dog. It made little sense to me. Plus it sounded strange. There was just something off about it. It reminded me of someone imitating a bark. Like how even if they are really good at it, the result would still sound a little different from a real dog barking. That's what it sounded like. A convincing bark with just a remainder of a human's voice resonating within it. It's strange how something as small as this, something that seems like a negligible detail on first glance, can trigger an impulse that is so sudden and yet so strong that one just cannot help but obey it. So, overrun by the sudden fear creeping up inside me, I stood up. My left leg immediately beginning to ache about 3 times as bad as before, but I ignored it. Instead, I began limping into the direction of the wood's edge. The many days I had spent running around this forest with my aunt and uncle paid off. I was injured, scared, and weak, but I knew which way to go. By now, there was just enough light left to illuminate the ground in front of me. I hobbled through the woods, slow and yet way faster than I had moved on all fours. The pain in my leg was worsening. I gritted my teeth and I hobbled on. I did not stand still, not even when I noticed the slight rustling in the underbrush, seemingly following me. Finally, I could see the forest's edge in front of me. I let out a gasp as I started going just a little bit faster, hurrying towards it. And that's when I heard it. A long, deep growl coming from somewhere behind me. I pressed my hand to the front of my mouth before I could let out a scream. What followed was the sound of something leaping out of the bushes nearby. I didn't dare to turn around. I needed to act quickly. I seemed to still be at a safe distance, if I was just fast enough. I figured I could make it to the safety of the house, but my mind was racing. My instincts took over. While these thoughts were still shooting through my head, I burst into a sprint. I ran. I actually ran. Every step I took, ungainly placing my injured foot in front of me. Hurt in a way that would have probably made me pass out in any other situation. But the sound of that unnatural growling and barking, the noise of large paws drumming on the ground as whatever was chasing me picked up its speed, kept going. How I did not trip and fall is beyond my understanding. I stumbled on, crossing the grass fields, wheezing and blinking as I tried to keep tears of pain and fear from blinding me. My pursuer got closer. I could hear the growling and panting growing louder and louder. And that's when I knew that I would not make it. Not to the house, at least. But there, almost right in front of me, was the tree that carried the treehouse. I ran towards it and hastily began to pull myself up the ladder, my sweaty fingers cramping around the rope as to avoid slipping. Had I failed to do so, I surely would have fallen to my death at the paws of this thing. But somehow, I made it up and drew in the rope ladder after me. Panting, I crawled over to the window overlooking the edge of the woods and the part of the meadow that I had just crossed. Thankfully, with the moonlight not being blocked out by any trees anymore, I could see just about everything that I needed. And there it was. Right underneath the tree stood a giant of a dog. Its filthy fur was still standing on end in an open display of aggression. It looked around, its large head swinging and its teeth clenched, saliva dripping from its maw. It was looking for me. Confused, it began to circle the tree, not noticing that I was following it from window to window. Finally, it came to a halt underneath the entrance of the treehouse where it raised its head and he looked up at me. I let out a gasp as our eyes met. I could not see everything due to the relative darkness, but the chill running down my spine was enough to confirm that these eyes were not that of a dog. Their gaze felt draining and empty, and I could clearly feel the wrath radiating from them. This was something else, and it was the very thing that my uncle had warned me about. I stared down at the beast perched underneath the tree as it stared back at me. I don't know what I was thinking when I decided to yell at it. I guess I thought that I could make it go away. "Get away from me! Get lost!" I shouted. For a moment, I was silent. Then the thing let out an unearthly scream, rose to its hind paws and stood upright. I just stared. It must have stood around 7 feet tall, and we must have stayed like this for a minute or two, or at least it felt like that. And then finally it let out a long howl, and it turned and ran away on its hind legs. I rushed to the window across from where I had just stood and I watched it disappear back into the woods, and to where it had come from. I stood there for a while, unable to comprehend what had just happened. When I was sure that it would not come back, I threw out the rope ladder and I climbed back down. Just when my feet hit the ground, a sharp pain in my left leg reminded me of what was probably a sprained ankle. I limped over to my aunt and uncle's house. Upon approaching, I found that there was a note on the door. I gently detached the piece of paper from the needle with which it had been stuck to the wood. "Dear Clover, your uncle and I are at the hospital. He felt really dizzy, so I decided it'd be best to have a doctor look at him. Please use the spare key to let yourself in. I can't tell you when we'll be back, but I trust you can stay here on your own for a few hours. You're a big girl after all. Love, Jeanette." I bent down to grab the hidden spare key from under the doormat, unlocked the door, and I got inside. I barricaded myself, making sure all the doors and windows were shut and locked. And then I sank down onto the couch and I freed my now swollen ankle from my shoe and sock. When my aunt and uncle came home an hour later, my aunt almost got a heart attack. "Oh my God, honey, what happened?" she shrieked. "I fell off a tree," I said calmly. "Oh no, we shouldn't have left you alone. I'm so sorry," she cried. "I'll get you to the hospital immediately." Uncle Robert, who had a bandage neatly wrapped around his head, looked a little bit better than before. He picked me up and he carried me to their car, where he climbed with me into the back seat. He joked about how the hospital staff was going to be really surprised when they'd see the same people come in again, and to which Jeanette told him to shut up. I glanced down at my ankle and then at my torn jeans. Robert went quiet and looked at me, and then bent down and said in a low voice, "There was something else going on though, wasn't there?" For a moment, I did not quite know how to tell him, but then I just murmured, "There were some wild animals in the woods. I had to really hurry to get home." He just nodded and gave me a sympathetic look, a look that told me that he knew what I meant. Apart from my aunt's constant apologies, there was not a word spoken on the entire car ride there. Fortunately, when we arrived at the hospital, a doctor was able to check up on my leg right away. And just as I had thought, my ankle was sprained. I had also twisted my leg in the process of falling, and I had a contusion on my left knee. I remember being unable to sleep that night. Not only was my foot still in pain, but I could not stop thinking about what I had seen. I knew that I didn't just imagine it, but I just couldn't believe it either. Just the thought of that moment when it stood up on two paws made me shiver. It made me wonder why my uncle did not insist on moving away when he had first encountered this thing. I never saw that dog again. I call it a dog reluctantly, seeing as I know for sure that this was something entirely different. I spent just 2 more summers with my aunt and uncle. It just wasn't quite as pleasant anymore. Every night I spent at their place would be a sleepless one. The memory of the chase. The thoughts of that creature and the sound of paw steps circling the house when everybody else was already asleep kept me awake. I must have suppressed these memories. Or maybe it's just one of these things that you forget about when you get older. And yet, I am typing this because it all came flooding back to me today. Today of all days, so many years later, I happened to turn on the radio on just the right channel, and in just the right moment to hear the moderator announce an old song that I had never heard before. Indeed, I had never heard of the legend before. But when the voice narrating the poem began to tell the tale of dogmen roaming the Michigan woods, I was immediately brought back into the treehouse, staring down at the creature as it stood up on 2 paws. Now the only thing I can think of is that somewhere around Wexford County, there are dogs walking upright, and that on some large tree, there are the remains of the treehouse that saved me that night. I wonder how Uncle Robert is doing.